In this interview, I'll be talking with Duncan Burt of Reactive Technologies about the April 28th power grid failure in Spain and Portugal. Welcome to the interview, Duncan.
Malcolm, great to be here, and thanks for having me.
What happened in the Iberian Peninsula is very, very interesting because it has a high percentage of renewables in the grid, and critics of renewables pointed to this blackout as evidence that any grid with high percentage of renewables is inherently unstable. So that's kind of the context, the background for our conversation today. Maybe we could start with just a broad explanation of what happened and why it happened.
Absolutely, absolutely. And look, I mean, grids are some of the most complicated machines in the world. Yeah. And so let me say up front, that complexity means there is always going to be a risk of blackouts wherever you are. And the job of grid operators is to minimize that risk as much as is sensibly possible, given they're working in a community and they've got to keep the bills sensible. So a very quick summary of what happened. Really the vast majority of this incident is to do with the planning, the forecasting, and then the real-time or near real-time management of the stability of the grid, particularly the voltage stability of the grid. And grid collapses, and that's what Spain is. It's a collapse as well as a blackout. Really, the grid collapses are like airplane crashes. There's never one factor. There's always lots of things, lots of little things often that have gone wrong in a really unlucky sequence. And then even on top of that, you tend to have to be unlucky right at the end before something goes really badly wrong. So let me give you a really quick summary. Spain is a pretty high renewable system. It tends to run between 50 and 80% renewables. It's connected to the wider European grid, one of the largest single grids in the world, similar in size to the Eastern Interconnect in the US and Canada. And Spain is on that transition to very high renewables operation, but because they're part of a big grid, a lot of their planning assumptions and grid development assumptions are, slower. They're around the fact that they're on a big grid and big grids are stable. So, for example, Spain doesn't have fast-acting batteries to provide frequency response. It doesn't have some of the sort of stabilization mechanisms that smaller grids like Hawaii or the UK or Australia would have. And it doesn't have some of the system awareness and measurement and monitoring tools, which would be considered good practice or best practice, if you're a small, high renewables system. So what happened is that the voltage profile in Spain has been looking pretty tight and pretty unstable and getting tighter for the last few years. When you read through the report, it's clear that the day-ahead plan for operation on the 28th was well set up. They knew what they were doing. Their challenge is both keeping the voltage up during parts of the day, but also keeping the voltage not too high. And that's because there is a lot of distributed plant on the grid in Spain, deep down, on rooftop solar and such like. And therefore, the system is quite lightly loaded. It's not got much power flowing across the main system. So you have to keep the voltage down because otherwise it runs away from you. And just to then walk you through on the day. So the voltage on the day started a little bit higher than it should have done, which is a problem because once you're a little bit high, it's like having your plane flying off route. You tend to get worse during the day. They then had a series of incidents around oscillations, and the method that they chose to strengthen the system was to switch in some of the lines that they'd switched out to keep the voltage down, and that inevitably pushes the voltage up. But they didn't have all the awareness tools that you'd necessarily want to have when you're in that tight situation, and therefore they didn't see it necessarily as a voltage problem. They just saw it as quite bouncy voltage, to be blunt. That system grew worse through the morning to the point where, with hindsight, I mean, it's easy with hindsight, isn't it, Markham? The system was really fragile, but they didn't know it because they didn't have the sort of stability measurement and tools that would tell you that. And then they had some tiny changes in flow at lunchtime. That pushed the voltage far too high. because it was so fragile that it responded much, much more and increased much more quickly than an operator would have reasonably expected. And that led to some local substations which had both renewables and conventional plant on them. It led to those substations tripping in sequence due to high volts. And that then led to a cascade of higher volts, which within about 20 seconds led to the collapse of the system.
Dan, I've interviewed I don't know how many experts on power grids, and a theme has emerged that the grid that you might have had back in the days when you had central power plants like steam, gas and coal is not the grid you need when you get to a reasonable percentage of renewables. You have to add things like battery storage and digital controls and more interconnections and so on and so forth. And it sounds like because Spain and Portugal were part of the bigger European grid, did they not think that they had to make some of these other changes to protect the grid from what happened?
Yeah, look, to be fair to Spain, they have been making some of those changes. So they've been increasing interconnection. And you probably, as listeners probably know, Mark, in Europe, we've seen a huge increase in interconnection between states in the last 20 years. There's a European target, an old European target of 10% that everyone's beaten by miles. So yeah, they were making some of those changes, but they didn't have the awareness and the measurement tools which would have told them quite how far the system had changed. And your analogy is absolutely spot on. You know, running a traditional power grid is a bit like driving a steam train, you have to use an analogy, whereas driving a high renewables grid is a bit like driving a car or even a sports car. So it's much more flexible. You can do many more things with it, but you need to be aware and you need to understand that you're driving something that's going to behave very differently. And you need the input, the feel through the steering wheel and those kind of things to really understand that. And yeah, that's clearly one of the things that's gone wrong.
Is it fair to say that given the rapid rollout of renewables in some power grids, that the odd failure like this is almost inevitable as we gain experience, as we begin to implement some of these new tools you're talking about? And the important thing here, I would think, is to learn from others' experience and continue to adapt your grid so that it is more stable with a higher percentage of renewables. Fair to say?
I think it's certainly fair to say that, well, it's fair to say that you can run a renewables grid as, if not more reliably than a traditional grid. No doubt about it. No doubt about it at all. It would be silly to say that we knew everything about running a high renewables grid in the same way that we've got 100 years of running a traditional grid. But operators globally are very conscious of the fact that there will be these sort of Donald Rumsfeld unknown unknowns, yeah. But we know that we know an awful lot about running them, and the main challenge at the moment is, my mother used to say to me, "There's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothes." Yeah, you must have that in Canada, and the tools, learning, and knowledge is out there. The level of collaboration that you see between grids and between engineers these days in organizations like IEEE and CGRE is absolutely enormous. There are 2 to 3, if not 10 times the people going to these knowledge sharing conferences that there were 10 years ago. And most of the developed world grids have these very extensive technical plans that map out the specifics of their transition. So it's eminently doable. You do have to be on it. And I guess like everything in life, I mean, someone might say, well, you have to be lucky. But I would say you make your own luck in this. Yeah, you can plan for it and you can be ready for it. There are obviously regulatory pressures around cost, and some of those investments are really replacements, but it's always additional money that you've got to justify, even if it's not adding to the bill in total. But yeah, so you've always got to watch it.
There is some context here that's important to Canada because we had an election a couple of months ago. We now have a new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who's well known as an economist and bank governor, including your country and my country.
Very well known in the UK.
Yes, and one of the things he promised during the election campaign was to link, basically create a national grid in Canada. Because right now we have, basically 13 little islands, and there's
Yep.
not much east-west trade, not much in the way of interconnections between provinces. And it would seem to me now, as the debate moves forward in earnest, some of these questions are going to come to the fore. And question of stability. What do you do when you run into some of these problems? And so the story of what happened in Spain and Portugal has broader implications for those grids that are coming behind and looking at, more integration, more renewables, that sort of thing. Would you agree?
Well, look, the first thing I'd say is that I mean you have some fantastic engineering in Canada. We're working with a number of the engineering firms and the operators up there, and there's some superb work being done. And like I say, I think those plans are well set out and well understood in Canada. It's definitely true to say that in North America as a whole, you don't have the same level of interconnectivity and meshing of the grid that there is in Europe, and that's probably 50% policy and 50% just the economics of the fact that North America is huge with quite sparsely populated areas. So inevitably you're going to see less. But I mean, the first and most important thing is to really think about it and make sure that the operators are working together. You've got where you don't have interconnection across Canada, you have very good interconnection into the US, and some very robust organizations that are coordinating that at the North American level, not a US level. Yeah, so that works very well. But yeah, it would not surprise me at all if some of the engineering solutions to make the Canadian grid more resilient included additional interconnection, both down south to the US and also, as you say, Markham, east-west, to really tie it up.
Of the roughly five reasons for the blackout in Spain and Portugal, one of them is weak interconnections. Apparently, there was only about 3% of the demand was provided by interconnections, and is the European target apparently is 15%. So is that one of the things, like, will the European Union, will Spain and Portugal, how does that work to build more interconnections? And again, we have to do this in Canada. So are there lessons to be learned?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. One of the things that European policymakers have put a lot of effort on is sort of overarching bodies and coordination, and we all know that Europe is very good at regulation. Yeah, and so you do have coordinating bodies at a continental level, such as ENTSO-E, ENTSO-E, who coordinate an overarching system plan for the whole of Europe that must hit those targets. And that is effectively, it's an integrated resource plan for the whole of the continent that pulls together all of the individual resource plans for different states. And and then the other side of that equation is that there is funding available for infrastructure that help meet those targets, and funding is prioritized for infrastructure that delivers those targets. So yeah, if you want to build an interconnector in Europe between two countries that are poorly served on interconnection, there is a very, very good chance you will get funding at a European level to do that. And so yeah, that has really turbocharged those kind of investments in Europe. Really not, to start with, both from a security point of view, but the main reason the European Union started doing it was because it reduced overall costs for consumers. You're joining markets together, you're making bigger markets, more liquidity, therefore you're reducing costs. The side benefit of that, and now one of the main issues, is obviously it increases the security, and reliability of the grid as a whole.
I want to talk a little bit about the fact that there's inverter-based resources, wind and solar primarily, that don't have the spinning inertia that a coal plant or a gas plant would have. And I've interviewed engineers who say, look, there are things you can do. You can use these grid forming inverters. You can use digital controls. You can install battery storage. Maybe you could give us just a brief overview of how some of those technology, what's available, and what a grid can do to as the renewables share grows, what technologies it can add to the grid to offset that declining inertia from the thermal plants.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a lot. It can get very technical very quickly, so I'll keep it high level, Markham. Yeah, and we'll see how
Thank
we
you.
do. But just sort of virtually slap me if I say something too detailed. So yeah, you're right. So the key things you lose when you change to a high renewable system is you lose inertia, and you lose things like synchronous damping, which is really the same thing. It's the strength that comes from these big bits of rotating metal that keep the grid in synchronism. And you also lose something called fault in feed, which is really something that underpins voltage stability. It reflects the sort of the amount of power that will flow through the grid if there's a disturbance. And as you say, there's several things you can do. The main tools traditionally to solve that were to use synchronous condensers, which is basically a traditional generator spinning in air on its own, but with no power or no steam or push going through it to push power into the grid. You can use flywheels, very much like an old steam engine would use a flywheel to stabilize its mechanisms. And then, as you say, and you can also use a lot of existing plant. So pump storage, for example, tends to be able to act as a flywheel or spin in air anyway. And a lot of utilities are using those already around the world. In terms of new technology, there are an awful lot of sophisticated sort of digital devices that you can use to provide that control. But really, they all come together through the inverter as a grid forming inverter rather than a grid following inverter. And a grid forming inverter basically tries to replicate electrically exactly what a large steam turbine would be doing during a disturbance. Yeah, so that it provides the same backup in stability. But obviously, because you're doing it digitally, you can spec it to be better at voltage support or better at inertia or whatever. And alongside that, alongside the deployment of those tools, the measurement of inertia, of voltage stability, of oscillations becomes really critical because they've stopped being byproducts and they start becoming critical security constraints on the system. So if you get measurement and then you've got mitigation with synchronous condensers and grid forming, then you go a long way. But that's the sort of baseline picture. And then there's a whole separate questions about how much of that you can deploy and how you deploy it, which I'm sure you might ask me.
Well, I might, but I think we would probably be having this interview all morning if we do that.
Yeah.
So let's wrap up the interview this way. You mentioned earlier that you can actually have a more flexible and resilient grid with a high percentage, maybe even 100% renewables, which flies in the face of a lot of the public narrative around power grids. And maybe could you give us an overview of, as we go forward over the next 5 or 10 years, what Europe needs to do in order to build such a grid, that is either 100%, 80%, 90% renewables. What does it need to do?
Yeah, well, the top three things we've touched on already. So it is, I mean, obviously you need to build out the renewables. Yeah, that's fundamental. But you've got to get ahead of that, and Europe really needs to get ahead of that on building out the grid, both using traditional grid and grid enhancing technologies to really get as much out of the network as possible. You've got to measure and then mitigate those inertia and voltage stability issues that I talked about with the deployment and measurement and the deployment of things such as synchronous condensers and grid forming. There's still some technical work to do to get it all to work together with very large levels of grid forming, but that research is happening in North America, in the UK and Europe, and in Australia as well. And we have enough to do the next 5 years already. And then you need the markets that really underpin, the adoption of now very high levels of electric vehicles in Europe, and then electrification of heat coming behind it. And those markets are coming in Europe, in Scandinavia. There are some moves in France and Germany as well, to really allow aggregated participation of portfolios of EV chargers and such like. And they don't only achieve the best price for consumers, they also will really help with the stable and resilient operation of the grid. Those are the big three things that need to happen, and they are all happening in Europe.
And I guess that's my takeaway from this, Duncan, is that as unfortunate as it was that had the Iberian blackout, it's also true that as renewables ramp out, as grids are changing, modernizing and becoming something different than they were for the last 125 years, is that regulators, governments, policymakers, utilities, and so on are grappling with this issue. And it sounds like you feel confident that we have what is required if we implement it and do what we need to do.
That's right, 100% competent.
Duncan, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Great to speak to you, Malcolm.